That means there's a zone of cloudy and occasionally damp weather affecting Wales, the Midlands, East Anglia first thing before eventually that pushes into southern counties of England. For a time, some sunshine ahead of that, but it does cloud over in the far southeast. Meanwhile, brighter skies follow for much of Wales, the North Midlands, Northern England, and for Scotland, Northern Ireland, another day of keen winds and heavy showers in places. Those showers falling as sleet and snow over hills, but perhaps even to lower levels at times for the north and northwest of Scotland, where it will feel cold, highs of 3 to 5 Celsius. But when you add on that wind, you can take off a few degrees for the feels-like temperature, whilst it's mild in the far south, 12 or 13 Celsius, but increasingly damp actually as we go into the evening. Outbreaks of rain on and off, particularly for southwest England and the far south. Meanwhile, clearer spells follow for much of Wales, the Midlands, and for the rest of the north of the UK. Clear spells overnight mean that there'll be a few icy patches first thing Thursday. So watch out for those slippery surfaces where we've seen showers come and go through the night, and some significant snow building up over the Highlands by this stage. Also, a very windy start to the day for the north of Scotland. Gales or even severe gales for a time before an area of low pressure moves away. Once that's out of the way, actually many places seeing some good spells of sunshine. Further showers in the west and northwest, but it is going to be increasingly settled for Friday. Plenty of sunshine around, just a few showers still in the north and west, and feeling colder for all of us with temperatures at around 6 to 8 Celsius.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before. It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
A very good morning to you. It's 9:30 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and on your radio. I'll be bringing you all the latest from yesterday's mini reshuffle, PMQs today, and the shocking grooming gangs report. And stick around at the end for my NHS fact check. But first, here's your morning's headlines.
A very good morning to you. It's 9:30. I'm Rosie Wright here to keep you up to date on GB News. Now, a cross-party group of MPs is urging the government to do more to ease the higher costs and paperwork firms face due to Brexit. The Public Accounts Committee also warns there may be lengthier border delays and lorry queues once passenger numbers return to normal, as expected later this year. The Health Minister, Gillian Keegan, has apologised for continuing an in-person meeting despite finding out that she tested positive for coronavirus in a lateral flow test. Posting on Twitter, the MP said she'd taken the test before the meeting and asked her visitors if they were happy to continue after discovering the result. She says on reflection, she realises this was an error of judgment. The Health Secretary has pledged to recruit 15,000 new health workers by the end of March. It comes as Sajid Javid warned the NHS waiting list in England will not start to fall for another 2 years. About 6 million people are currently waiting for routine treatment. The government's outlined some of its plans to improve the links between the NHS and social care in its integration white paper. Under the new plans, patients will have a digital care record where they can easily book appointments and order prescriptions. Adele has made a...
Congratulations.
Adele has made a triumphant return to the Brit Awards by picking up 3 of the biggest prizes on the night. Song of the Year, Album of the Year and the now gender-neutral category Artist of the Year. Other winners included Sam Fender, who won Best Rock and Alternative Artist, while Songwriter of the Year went to Ed Sheeran. You're up to date here on GB News, on your TV, online and DAB Plus radio. Now let's head for the briefing with Tom.
Good morning, it's 9:32 and welcome to the briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and on your radio. Now, the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, has had a rocky week with a new set of advisers in number 10, the Jimmy Savile row still stretching on, and the Ukraine crisis continuing. What on earth is in store for Prime Minister's questions at midday today? Well, let's talk through this all now with the news editor at the Conservative Home website, Henry Hill. Welcome to the programme, Henry. Is the Prime Minister, first of all, after this is now getting on for 2 months of ups and downs, is he in a stronger place before PMQs this week than he was last week?
I mean, I suppose in as much as we haven't got another photograph or email, putting him at some new event, it's probably maybe one of the better weeks he's had in a while. Although obviously there were press reports that photographs are circulating, so they may come out in the press at some point. And he's obviously conducted his mini reshuffle, but I think that actually looking at the substance of that reshuffle, it really doesn't suggest that he thinks he's in a strong position. It looked almost entirely defensive. He wasn't able to move any of the big roles in his cabinet, and he was mostly sort of just drawing in a wagon circle of loyalists around his leadership in the event of a challenge, which I suspect he's coming. So a better week than some of the ones he's had recently, but that's an extraordinarily low bar to clear.
Certainly is. And of course, Keir Starmer will have a wealth of content to go after. I wonder if he'll be thinking of bringing up that protest that surrounded him on Monday, or potentially a story that's broken in the last half an hour or so about the Minister Gillian Keegan, the Conservative MP, testing positive for COVID while on a visit to see, I think it was bereaved families, only to continue that visit after testing positive. What on earth is this all about?
Well, I mean, having read it, it seems slightly unusual in that I was conducting this visit. She'd taken the lateral flow test, I think, before doing the visit, but not waited for the results, which seems to sort of obviate the point of doing a flow test at all. And then when she was in the middle of this meeting with these people, the result came in, and it was that she was positive. And she said to them, are you happy for me to continue the meeting? And they said yes. Now, I think if you're in that situation, it's understandable how you or I might do that. If you've already met someone, you've already shared air with them for 10 minutes, and suddenly the news content that you've tested positive, you can see why everyone will be like, well, we've been exposed to this now. But I think the question is, if you're taking tests before conducting visits, given that they only take 15 minutes to come back, why aren't you taking them in time to get the result before you go and see people? It's slightly baffling, I think, as a story.
So I suppose when you put it like that sequentially, it's almost understandable. You do a quick test, you rush in, you meet the people, you want to be sympathetic to the people that you're seeing. But ultimately, I suppose, epidemiologically, there's a difference between sharing air for 10 minutes with someone and sharing air for an hour with those same group of people.
Yeah, and I'm not exactly sure what the timings are. What I mean is that from a sort of a level of the practical level at which many of us, I think, interacted with the COVID rules, once you're in with someone, I can understand why everyone just concluded that the meeting should continue. I think the real question is if you've got a system which seems perfectly sensible of your minister seeing a lot of people, especially potentially vulnerable people, if you've got a system where you're taking tests to make sure you're safe before you go into meetings, why aren't you giving those tests time to come back before you go into the meeting? The timing thing that seems strangest to me is that she took the lateral flow test and then didn't know the result until she'd already started. When I had to, take tests to go into venues, I couldn't just take it, and then even to get it once, I think to get into GBNews, I had to wait until it came back positive before I was allowed in the building. That's how that system works. So that's the thing that baffles me about whatever system her department was running, is there's no point taking the test and then just going in anyway. The only way you protect people is if you wait for the result to come back first.
To say, I'm getting really tired with all of these COVID stories, whether someone had a beer or not, whether it's something to do with a lateral flow test. It just seems like this is invading our politics and will continue for some time. Just finally in this conversation, Henry, we heard from the government that all the COVID rules might well drop away next month. Do you see that timeline as charging forward as realistic?
I think currently, politically, it seemed perfectly realistic. There hasn't been a new and terrifying variant since Omicron. And politically, I think the government is in a very tricky position with regarding COVID regulations because, as you say, it keeps getting tripped up by these stories about how difficult the rules were to follow or how, fast and loose certain people played with them. And so it would be much easier for the government for the COVID rules to lapse. One, they'll be hoping that it provides them with a kind of general good news boost, although the rules are so light touch at this point, relatively speaking, that I'm not entirely sure that will be the case. But it will also just take a little bit out of the sting out of COVID hypocrisy stories. Conversely, in the event that there is a new variant in the future, I think one of the big dangers of the way these stories have unfolded for the government is that it's not actually clear that the Prime Minister will have the moral authority to reimpose lockdown or anything else at this point, given the way that he personally handled them.
Yes, it's a tricky situation for the Prime Minister pushing forward with this stuff. We'll wait and see what comes up at Prime Minister's Questions at midday today. Of course, we can see that on GB News. But for now, Henry Hill, thank you very much for joining us on The Briefing this morning. One of the things we mentioned in that conversation, of course, was that little reshuffle. And Jacob Rees-Mogg moved from his post as Leader of the House of Commons to become a new Minister for Brexit Opportunities and Government Efficiency during that shuffle. Is this red meat to the parliamentary Tory party or genuinely a substantive role that could change the course of this government? Well, I'm delighted to be joined now by rockstar academic Professor Anand Menon, Director of the UK in a Changing Europe think tank at King's College London. Welcome to the programme. First of all, that question, is this just sort of surface level? Is this just a media play? Or is this role genuinely substantive in your view?
I mean, there's no reason it can't be both. I think there's no doubt about it. You're spot on. This is red meat for the Tory backbenchers. Putting Jacob Rees-Mogg in terms of in charge of Brexit opportunities is a great sop to those on the right who don't think the Prime Minister's done enough. On the other hand, that doesn't mean there aren't things that Mr. Rees-Mogg will be able to do to seize some of the opportunities of Brexit. There are ways we can regulate better now we're out of the European Union. The issue, I think, is whether there's enough consensus within the Conservative Party in Parliament to identify a way forward and stick to it. And that I'm not sure about.
Interesting that Jacob Rees-Mogg was put in this position, because it seems to me there are different flavours of Conservative politician when it comes to seizing the opportunities of Brexit. Certainly, Theresa May was someone who was not interested in regulatory divergence, in getting rid of EU rules, whereas someone like Jacob Rees-Mogg, and indeed someone like Lord Frost, were very much in favour of changing those rules, of, some might say, a more Singaporean-style Brexit. I think no one really knows where Boris Johnson is on this issue. Is he a deregulator or is he not? Is he somehow a Brexity Hezzer, as he was once described, referring to Michael Heseltine there? Does Jacob Rees-Mogg being in this position make deregulation more likely?
Yes and no. On the one hand, it's absolutely clear that Mr. Rees-Mogg himself would like to see greater deregulation, would like to see lower taxes. I mean, he's staked a position very much on the right of the party when it comes to economic policy. But as you said, ultimately, these big decisions are going to be down to the Prime Minister. And one of the paradoxes about Brexit so far, if you like, is we have used our newfound autonomy in many ways to become more European. We're spending more as a state. We're relaxing subsidy control rules. And those aren't the sorts of things that people like Mr. Rees-Mogg backed Brexit in order to achieve. He saw Brexit, I think, as an opportunity to reduce regulations. The question now is whether or not the government is politically strong enough to drive that programme forward in the face of what is going to be, I think, significant opposition, both within its own ranks and from some businesses who, A, are keen to maintain high standards, and B, are aware of the fact that if we diverge too far from EU rules, it will make it more expensive for them to trade with the European Union.
It's interesting, there's this sort of Schrodinger's reshuffle here, whereby, to some extent, the Prime Minister's weakness has put a harder Brexiteer in a new Brexit role, but also the Prime Minister's weakness might mean that that person in that role isn't able to do what they want to do. It will be fascinating to watch and to see how this all develops. I'm afraid we've run out of time on this interview, but Anon Menon, thank you very much for coming on and explaining that all for us there. Really interesting times. Now, moving on to our next story today, the latest report published by the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse has suggested that British authorities are still failing to address the industrial-scale sexual exploitation of children. The inquiry said local councils are continuing to fail to properly identify and investigate child grooming gangs, and concluded that officials often denied the true scale of the problem and judged it was on the wane instead of where it was. So what's going wrong? Well, joining me now is research fellow from the Centre on Radicalisation and Terrorism at the Henry Jackson Society, Rakib Ehsan. Welcome to the programme. And you've written about this inquiry, about this report. What does it really tell us?
Well, Tom, where would I even start? Firstly, it's very clear that many of our public authorities are continuing to fail to tackle group-based child sexual abuse, and there's various dynamics at play which would provide us with much cause for concern. There are very serious gaps when it comes to recording and collecting data based on the ethnicity, sex and age of perpetrators. There are also issues surrounding the use of unregulated, unsupervised accommodation for young people. We're even talking about young people being left in caravans and tents, which is quite astonishing, really, because these kind of settings, the level of supervision may vary, the level of support may well be limited at best, and that makes those young people more vulnerable to grooming and sexual exploitation. And there are also issues when it comes to local councils and police forces, as you say, suggesting that these problems are on the wane. This latest report on grooming gangs suggests that that is not the case, and that there's a culture that's developing within public authorities that they don't want to be known as the new Rochdale or the new Rotherham. But what I feel here is that you have public sector officials who should very much be in the business of prioritising child safety, but instead they're protecting their own reputations.
Much of this is to do with political correctness. Because, of course, the original charge with regard to this issue is people felt incredibly squeamish, for understandable reasons, about saying that this was predominantly Asian grooming gangs grooming predominantly white young girls. Actually, I probably shouldn't say Asian grooming gangs, because it was specifically Pakistani males, I think, in the round that was this particular problem. But saying that seemed to be so very hard for local authorities.
Well, I think it's an absolute disgrace, the fact that it's so difficult for them to admit this. There have been a number of high-profile cases of Pakistani origin men sexually abusing underaged white British girls. And there's one case, the closing of Operation Augusta in Greater Manchester. So this was an investigation where the majority of the perpetrators, suspects, were people who were suspected of being involved in group-based child sexual abuse. were predominantly of Pakistani origin. And then what you had there, you had an independent review which suggested that this investigation was starved of public resources. And then Greater Manchester Police, with the support of the Manchester City Council, prematurely closed down the investigation. So if you have that, and then you have police forces such as South Yorkshire, where the vast majority of the cases, cases where they're looking at group-based child sexual abuse, in the vast majority of cases, ethnicity isn't being recorded, then naturally that's going to heighten suspicions that local authorities are ultimately prioritising racial sensitivities over the safety of the most vulnerable in our society. And Tom, I'd make the point that one of the markers of a truly civilized society is the degree to which its public authorities protect the most vulnerable. And Britain, unfortunately, is failing miserably when it comes to tackling child sexual abuse.
I'm sure this will come as a shock to many people who thought that we were sort of making headway on this issue, who thought that finally the mainstream media was talking about it, that something was being done. But it seems like we maybe haven't made as much progress as we should. It's really important to have these conversations and keep this issue alive in the media. Well, Rakib Ehsan, thank you for joining us today to do just that here on The Briefing on GB News. Well, now to a story that we talked about yesterday. Pornography websites will be legally required to institute age checks from credit cards to passports to ban any under 18-year-old from accessing pornographic websites. The Online Safety Bill, which in part intends to prevent under 18s from accessing adult material on the internet, will be altered to include all commercial pornography websites. It's something that the government ditched a couple of years ago, but has now brought back. Well, why have they done so? Let's discuss this now with Daniel Pryor, Head of Programmes at the Adam Smith Institute, of course, a neoliberal think tank that have slammed the government's decision to introduce this new regulation. Why now?
Well, I guess what they're trying to do is beef up their dog's dinner of an online safety bill as much as possible with things that they think will be popular, even though, as you mentioned, this has been scrapped several times when it's been tried in the past simply because it doesn't work. It's going to put our privacy at risk. It's an absolute gift to fraudsters. And if you create a centralized system like this for accessing adult material online, you're basically putting up a big sign for scammers, blackmailers, and foreign governments saying, please hack me. And another thing that's been pointed out on this most recent proposal is you're actually encouraging people to give even more information on what they watch to adult sites. If you have to verify your age every time you visit a site, you're probably going to stop using that incognito mode on your browser, and that means you're going to have more tracking cookies, etc., that really take advantage of your viewing habits. Now, there are protections in place at this time to try and make sure that age verification data isn't linked to our viewing habits, but there are some pretty clear risks. It's not so long ago that MindGeek, who hilariously the parent company of the world's largest adult sites, just happens to be one of the bigger age verification providers. And they had 5 major data breaches since 2012. So it doesn't really give a very good track record. And of course, we all want to limit children's exposure to adult material online. But the question is, how do we actually reduce harm and do this without exposing millions of adults to the potential for things like credit card fraud and indeed a gross invasion of privacy? If
yes,
I was a parent,
that's an extraordinary point that you raised there, that one of these age checks, one of the big age checks, is actually owned by a porn company, and they've had data breaches and everything. And so actually getting people to give that porn company so much more information, that's going to beef up the porn industry rather than reduce it. I wonder in this conversation how much of this is simply out of touch politicians who don't know the way that the world works right now, who didn't grow up in a time of the internet being available. How much is this them denying what happens now and going for a harm elimination strategy, whereas a harm reduction strategy would be much better? Not abstinence, but safe practices. Because I just don't understand how any politician could sit there and say, realistically, that no 17-year-old boy is going to be able to access pornography online. Clearly they will. Clearly they'll get around the block. And clearly this law is not going to work.
Yeah, it's a classic case of do something-ism, even when the doing something here is going to make things far worse and not achieve the aim it's set out to. As you said, teenagers who want to find adult material online have been avoiding blocks since the dawn of internet porn. They know how to use VPN, or in fact, they may even go on the dark web where there's absolutely no oversight and lots of illegal material. I think it's important parents need to be as engaged as possible in their kids' internet use whilst respecting kids' privacy. And we also need to accept reality and just make sure that sex education in our schools makes it clear that porn is not the same as sex in real life. The privacy implications, I think, are often overlooked here. Imagine if you're living in a very socially conservative community, or you're a young LGBT person who ends up getting outed to your friends as a result of a data breach. I think most people intuitively recognize that privacy matters. If they've ever used an envelope to send a letter instead of just writing on a postcard, you understand why privacy matters. For me, it's the government trying to do something where they're going to make things worse and they don't understand how to regulate the internet, but they're pressing ahead regardless because they think it makes a few good headlines and it might save their terrible anti-free speech online safety bill.
Well, there we have it. We heard yesterday a charity saying that this was something good that would protect children. But here we have Dan Pryor of the Adam Smith Institute explaining that the details of this bill might actually do precisely the opposite, that children may well go into darker, more nefarious parts of the internet, that this may drive a shady industry further underground in a more damaging way. Dan Pryor, thank you so much for your time here today. It's a really important issue and one that I don't think is understood particularly widely in our politics. Now, yesterday, Health Secretary Sajid Javid announced a package of measures to help deal with those horrendous and ever-worsening NHS waiting lists. Yet, as the Labour Party keeps saying, even before the pandemic, people felt like things had gotten worse in the NHS. And as we all know, various opposition politicians and even less than rigorous media outlets go so far as to imply that the service has actually been cut over the last 10 years. MPs tell me they regularly receive letters alleging that the NHS has in some way had its budget reduced. I'm absolutely convinced that if you were to take a poll of the public asking, has the NHS been cut in the last decade, a substantial proportion, perhaps even a majority, would answer in the affirmative. But they'd be wrong. Very wrong. Although, for many, not wrong through fault of their own. Often this misinformed impression is the fault of a media that simply too often ignores or twists the facts in front of them. So here on GB News is a corrective. The NHS has not been cut. In fact, more cash has been plunged into this organisation than ever before. Tens of billions more. Here is the definitive budget, inflation adjusted, I should add, from the King's Fund. In 2009-10, the NHS had a budget of £124.1 billion. By 2022-23, the NHS has a budget of £173.8 billion, and that's excluding COVID-specific funding. It represents an increase of £50 billion. Or £962 million every single week since 2010. Yes, in real terms, funding for the NHS has swelled by 40%. A massive 40% increase since 2010. And yes, the population grew a bit too, but only by 8%. So some quick back-of-a-cigarette packet maths puts per-person funding at roughly £1,977 in 2009-10, up to £2,586 in 2022-23. That's 31% growth. Yes, you heard that correctly. 31% more cash into the NHS for every single person in the country compared to 2010. Inflation adjusted, I should add. And yet many feel like this service has been cut. Well, maybe, just maybe, that says more about how it's run and how much more money is thrown into it every single year. Well, that's the facts on the NHS budget, up by 40% in total, 31% per person. That's it for today on The Briefing. Coming up, it's To The Point with me and Mercy Muroki. But first, here's the weather.
Hello, good morning. I'm Aidan McGivern and here's your latest forecast. It's going to stay cloudy and mild in the south today with brighter weather but colder conditions elsewhere and further blustery showers for parts of Scotland and Northern Ireland. The weather front that stuck around yesterday across northern England, North Wales, parts of Northern Ireland is now finally sinking south. That means there's a zone of cloudy and occasionally damp weather affecting Wales, the Midlands, East Anglia first thing before eventually that pushes into southern counties of England. For a time, some sunshine ahead of that, but it does cloud over in the far southeast. Meanwhile, brighter skies follow for much of Wales, the North Midlands, Northern England, and for Scotland, Northern Ireland, another day of keen winds and heavy showers in places. Those showers falling as sleet and snow over hills, but perhaps even to lower levels at times for the north and northwest of Scotland, where it will feel cold, highs of 3 to 5 Celsius. But when you add on that wind, you can take off a few degrees for the feels-like temperature, whilst it's